demonstrating is a glenohumeral joint, or the shoulder, and it is a ball and socket joint and demonstrates 3 degrees of freedom. So some of the exercises you can do are shoulder flexion and shoulder extension, which occur on the sagittal plane or the YZ axes. And then you can do shoulder abduction, shoulder adduction, which occur on the frontal plane or the XY axes. And then finally, you can do shoulder lateral rotation and shoulder medial rotation, which occurs on the transverse plane or the XZ axes. Okay, so the next joint I'll be demonstrating is a cervix, which is a pivot joint, and it demonstrates 3 degrees of freedom. And the different exercises you can do with it are cervical flexion and cervical extension, which both occur on the sagittal plane or the YZ axes. And then you can do cervical rotation, which occurs on the transverse plane or the XZ axes. And then you can also do cervical lateral flexion, which occurs on the frontal plane or the XY axis. Now I'll show the humeral ulnar joint, or the elbow, and it is a hinge joint and demonstrates 1 degree of freedom. The exercises you can do with it are elbow flexion and elbow extension, which occurs on the sagittal plane and or the YZ axes. Now I'll be showing the radial-ulnar joints, or the forearms, and they are pivot joints and demonstrate 1 degree of freedom. So the exercise you can do is forearm supination and forearm pronation, which both occur on the transverse plane or the XZ axis. Alright, now I'll be showing the abdomen, or the trunk, and it is a pivot joint and demonstrates 3 degrees of freedom. And the exercises you can do with it are trunk rotation, which occurs on the transverse plane or the XZ axes. And then you can do lateral flexion, trunk lateral flexion, which occurs on the frontal plane or the XY axes. And then there's trunk flexion and trunk extension, which both occur on the sagittal plane or the YZ axis. So the next joint I'll be demonstrating is radiocarpal joints, or your wrists, and it is an ellipsoidal joint and demonstrates 2 degrees of freedom. And the exercises you can do with that are wrist flexion and wrist extension, which both occur on the sagittal plane or the YZ axes. And then you can also do radial deviation and ulnar deviation, which occur on the frontal plane or the XY axes. Now I'm showing the acetabulo-femoral joint, or the hips, and they are a ball and socket joint and demonstrate 3 degrees of freedom. So the exercises you can do with them are hip flexion, hip extension, which occur on the sagittal plane and or the YZ axes. And then there's hip abduction and hip adduction, which occurs on the frontal plane or the XY axes. And then finally, there's hip lateral rotation and hip medial rotation, which occurs on the transverse planes or the XZ axes. Alright, now I'll be showing the patellofemoral joint, or the knee, and it is a hinge joint and demonstrates 1 degree of freedom. The exercise you can do with it is knee flexion and knee extension, which occurs on the sagittal plane or the YZ axes. Okay, so the final joint I'll be demonstrating is the towel curl joint, or the ankle, and it is a hinge joint and demonstrates 3 degrees of freedom. And the exercises you can do with it ankle dorsiflexion, ankle plantar flexion, which both occur on the sagittal plane or the YZ axes. Then you can do ankle adduction and ankle abduction, which both occur on the transverse plane or the XZ axes. And then finally, you can do ankle inversion and ankle eversion, which both occur on the frontal plane or the XY axes.